So then we are back with the modern understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Israelic lineage. So then we can understand the time of the end, as per Yeshayahu the prophet. We find layers of understanding of the spring feast, the autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Hamashiach laid waste for many centuries. Reading from Yeshayahu the prophet, it's very important delineating sections of the instructions and also the prophets, mostly because the scripture, as widely known as the Codex, the original manuscripts do not have chapters and numbers. So then, related with the culture from where these manuscripts they come from, the understandings of the content, it's done via what the understanding of the scripture is given. Now then, those people who are so concerned with chapters and numbers and indications, simply it's not the way of reading the instructions, neither the prophets. Now then, there is the Western mindset and Eastern mindset. And from the perspective of the early portions of the scripture after the coming of the representative of the completion of the spring feast, when the Hamashiach, he first came as equal as he was per the other prophets. There is absolutely no distinction from the Hamashiach and the prophets previously, because he was always quoting from the prophets. So he was talking of the presence in his life as the presence of the divine word and lives of the prophets previously. So then, there is a lots of confusion regarding the early era of the congregations, or then the gatherings of the people, but primarily the great first movement of these early people after the completion of the spring feast were merely Hebrews. So, as far as when reaches Revelation, then there were a considerable amount of Gentiles that were more acquainted with the holy instructions. Now, John, known as Yochanan, he didn't receive the whole vision by himself. In fact, those were bits and pieces given by the prophets previously. Now then, people have a tendency of taking credit for what they do not do. Now then, Yochanan, he did not have any portions of himself. As the documents reveal, there are sections of Enoch, sections of Yeshayahu, section of Jeremiah, and these prophets previously, including Zechariah. So then, what Yochanan received was simply a reminder of what the prophets previously already had recorded. Now then, there is a bit of literary activity when the Greco people began their quest of recording the Hebrew text in their own language. That's why then Revelation is very confusing. Firstly, because it's not in chronological order. Second, there are no chapters and verses. And the third, the layer related with Shaphat, or then the judgment, it doesn't coincide with the content of the regular writings of Revelation. So obviously the person that wrote it included many factors that they simply didn't understand what they were writing. They were hearing what the Hebrews were talking of, but they themselves didn't understand what it meant. So they placed the content in the best knowledge they had of their own. But then, when making an analysis where these instructions they are coming from and why so many portions they don't coincide with the prophets, then is a situation of taking the time and researching why so many of those layers they do not fit with the prophets. So then, the early group, when they first were active, there is a person by the name Cornelius. And truly, the writings of the known New Testament, a lot of the information exists, but the problem is they do not coincide with the prophets. Now then, it's very unusual, speaking of the Hamashiach ben Yosef, without proper evidence of what the prophet said. Now then, those people who are thinking that the Torah was abolished, they have to deal with the problem of the autumn feast. So, when people they begin to read these New Testament, they think for some reason, as the Mashiach came, then he was rewriting history and the scripture in a way that it would later on become a center of the entire understanding, knowing then that the previous scripture was then abolished. A completely new idea. However, there is a problem with it, because the Hamashiach ben Yosef quoted Vaikra very often. So these means the Torah and the prophets, they are very much active. They were never abolished. Only a portion of it was completed. Now then, in this society, there is so much prone of new ideas. Now they have come to terms with their own interpretations, their own scripture, that the Torah and the prophets are yet active. So then, from a couple of perspectives, a person can determine either smart or scoundrels. But the scripture itself is given many layers related with what the Hamashiach ben Yosef was saying. And then the autumn feast in Galah. Now there are many situations going on in the world, many kinds of deals and layers of trade and tabernacling going on, and also the layer of military and what's going on in the world, security. And we find that the early movements of these early people were simply Hebrews. Now then, for some people it's very hard because they think, for some reason, because of their own workings in their lives, what they think is so hard to overcome is part of a normal nature of human beings when it is not. So they base the scripture from their own experiences, so as then the known fathers of the church did on their own. And they ended up interpreting a lot of portions of the scripture, and as far as the scripture, the original scripture, now these should be studied, then they substituted for interpretations of their own. That's the problem that most of these congregations are facing, because they are simply reading interpretations of those who lived what they thought was known as righteous life. Knowing that the right and left understanding comes from the Nicolaitans. So then, these I or I am that does not exist in the Hebrew text poses a very interesting type of research and study. Now then, the scripture from its original form gives us a pathway of hope via the prophets. Understandably, the temple is not yet rebuilt, and the services of the Shabbat are not restored. What we simply have is simply a waiting period until the Holy Temple or the Tabernacle is restored. Now what goes on from then on, the situation of reading the scripture and understanding the times and the seasons based from what then the Shilishim and also the prophets have pointed. So please stay tuned, much more coming up.